You probably think of your ancestors as primitive, grunting, dirty, stumbling through a dark world with no real understanding of anything. You picture them as lesser versions of you. Almost human but not quite. That image is almost completely wrong. And the evidence that dismantles it has been sitting in caves, in fossilized bones, in ancient tool fragments for decades. Scientists kept finding things that didn't fit, things that forced them to stop and ask a question most people never think to ask. What if intelligence didn't increase over time? What if it just changed direction? Your brain right now weighs about 3 pounds. It hums along inside your skull, filtering emails, scrolling feeds, half listening to conversations, while simultaneously planning what to eat for dinner. It is doing an enormous amount of work. But a lot of that work is remarkably shallow, and the cognitive abilities you actually rely on every single day, memory, spatial reasoning, long-term pattern recognition, sensory awareness, those abilities have been quietly shrinking for at least 10,000 years. Anthropologist David Geary at the University of Missouri published research in 2008 showing that since the agricultural revolution, the average human brain has decreased in volume by roughly 10%. 10%. That is not a rounding error. That is the size of a tennis ball of neural tissue gone. And Geary's explanation was not that humans got lazier. His explanation was more unsettling than that. When life gets easier, the brain stops building infrastructure it no longer needs. Think about what your ancestors had to hold in their heads every single day. Not just their own name and a 4-digit PIN. Every edible plant in a 50-mile radius. Which ones looked almost identical to the toxic ones? The migration routes of dozens of animal species across changing seasons. The behavioral patterns of predators, which sounds they made before they attacked. How their tracks looked in mud versus dry earth. How their behavior shifted when a storm was coming. The location of every water source within a day's walk. The social relationships of every person in their group. Who trusted whom? Who owed what to whom? Who was lying? This was not stored in a phone. It was not backed up anywhere. It lived entirely inside one human brain that could not afford to forget. Anthropologist Lynne Isbell at the University of California spent years studying the relationship between early primates and snakes, and what she found reframed the entire story of human vision. The reason your eyes are positioned at the front of your head, giving you precise binocular depth perception, rather than wide peripheral vision like most mammals, is almost certainly because your ancestors needed to detect camouflaged predators at close range. Your eyes are the way they are because of a survival problem your ancestors solved millions of years ago. That solution is still written into your skull. But here is where it gets stranger. Your ancestors were not just surviving, they were building, they were creating, they were doing things that when modern scientists first discovered evidence of them, were assumed to be much more recent. In 2018, researchers analyzing ochre pigment in a South African cave called Blombos found abstract geometric markings etched into a piece of rock. The markings were deliberate, intentional, repeated, and they were 73,000 years old. 73,000 years before the pyramids, before writing, before agriculture. A human being sat down and made something that had no survival function, something that existed purely as expression. You inherited that impulse. Every time you doodle in the margin of a notebook, every time you arrange objects on a shelf so they look right, you are doing something your ancestor did in a dark cave with a piece of red ochre 70,000 years before anyone thought to write it down. But the intelligence goes deeper than creativity. It goes deeper than memory. What your ancestors possessed and what most modern humans have almost entirely lost was an extraordinary fine-grained attunement to the physical world around them. Researcher Daniel Everett spent decades living among the Piraha people of the Amazon, and what he documented was a cognitive relationship with the environment that most people in the modern world cannot even conceive of. Navigation through dense rainforest with no landmarks and no tools, the ability to track animal behavior and make predictions accurate enough to live on. A spatial memory so precise that returning to a location visited once years earlier through a forest that had changed dramatically was not remarkable. It was ordinary. This is not magic. This is training. This is a brain that never stopped being used at full capacity because it could not afford to. Your ancestors had no margin for error. If they misread the sky, they got caught in a storm with no shelter. If they misjudged a plant, they died in hours. If they misread a person in their group, misread their intentions, their loyalties, their emotional state, they could be expelled from the only social safety net that existed. The cognitive pressure they were under every single day was immense. And brains, like muscles, respond to pressure by building. Now think about your own day. You woke up and a device told you the weather. You navigated using a voice that told you every turn. You ate food that someone else grew and someone else prepared, transported across a supply chain so vast and complex that no single person alive understands all of it. You communicated through systems that do most of the remembering for you. Every tool you depend on was built specifically to reduce the cognitive load on your brain. That is not a criticism, and it is a trade. And it is the trade your species has been making since the first stone tool reduced the hand strength required to butcher an animal. Every time you offload a cognitive task to a tool, your brain quietly reprioritizes. The neural pathways that would have maintained that skill begin to thin. Use it or lose it is not a metaphor. It is literally how neurons work. Archaeologist Wil Roebroeks at Leiden University has argued that the picture of prehistoric humans as cognitively simple is not based on evidence. It is based on assumption. For most of the 20th century, scientists looked at ancient tools and saw simplicity. They assumed that simple-looking tools meant simple thinking makers. But when they began analyzing those tools differently, studying the fracture patterns, the choice of stone, the sequence of strikes required to produce the shape, they found something remarkable. The cognitive planning required to produce even a basic hand axe, the kind made 1.7 million years ago, is substantial. You have to hold a three-dimensional mental model of a shape that does not yet exist. You have to anticipate how each strike will affect the next. You have to work backward from a finished object in your mind. That is abstract thinking. That is forward planning. And it was happening nearly 2 million years ago. Your ancestors were not accidentally smart. They were precisely, relentlessly, practically intelligent in ways that the modern world has almost no way of measuring. Because the modern world is not the environment that intelligence was built for. Here is the counterintuitive part. You do not live in a less demanding world. You live in a differently demanding world. The cognitive tasks your brain is now asked to perform. Processing fragmented information at high speed, managing dozens of simultaneous low-stakes decisions, sustaining attention in an environment engineered to break it, are genuinely difficult. Your brain is working hard, but it is working hard on problems that were invented in the last 50 years. And it is doing so with hardware that was built over 200,000 years for a completely different set of problems. That mismatch is not trivial. It shows up in your anxiety. It shows up in the peculiar restlessness you feel on a Sunday afternoon when there is nothing that needs doing. It shows up in the strange satisfaction you feel when you use your hands to make something. Build something, fix something, cook something from scratch. That satisfaction is not nostalgia. It is your brain recognizing a kind of demand it was actually built for. The evidence suggests your ancestors looked at the stars and navigated by them so precisely that Polynesian sailors crossed the open Pacific without instruments, reaching islands separated by thousands of miles of open ocean, landing within miles of their targets. It suggests that Aboriginal Australians encoded geographical information in songs, what researchers now call songlines, So accurately that landmarks described in music thousands of years old can still be matched to features in the landscape today. These were not primitive solutions. These were sophisticated cognitive systems developed by intelligent minds, sustained across generations without paper or screens. You carry those minds inside you, not as memory, not as instinct, but as capacity. The same brain architecture that navigated the open ocean, that tracked predators, that built social networks of stunning complexity out of nothing but human relationship. That architecture is still yours. It has not been replaced. It has been redirected. And that means something. It means that when you feel dull or scattered, or like your mind is not quite what you wish it were, the problem is probably not your brain. The problem is the mismatch between what your brain was built to do and what your daily life is actually asking it to do. Your ancestors were not stumbling through the dark. They were reading it. They knew which stars moved and which stayed fixed. They knew what the wind meant before the storm arrived. They knew how to be a human being in a world that had not yet learned to make things easy. You still have that brain. You just keep handing it a screen.